The courtroom was silent. Too silent. The gavel had slammed down, the echo ringing like a gunshot through the cold air. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, leaned forward, eyes dark with finality. In the matter of the state of Texas versus Elijah Jackson. Elijah sat frozen. He was only 17, a high school senior, a basketball star, a good kid. But here he was, in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound in cold steel. The court finds the defendant guilty on all charges. Gasps. A sharp cry from the back of the courtroom. Elijah's mother clutched her chest, shaking her head, her lips forming words she couldn't speak. His father sat stiff as a rock, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles turned white. Elijah's heart pounded against his ribs. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in state prison. A wail erupted from his mother. Elijah felt like the walls were closing in, the oxygen thinning in his lungs. He had done nothing. Nothing. His lawyer shot up, outraged. Your Honor, this is absurd. The evidence is sufficient, the judge cut in coldly. This court has reached its decision. Elijah's hands trembled as the bailiff approached. This was it. His life, stolen. But then, his voice broke through the noise. I need to make a phone call. The judge sighed, already standing up. Calls can be made at the correctional facility. No. Elijah lifted his chin, his dark eyes burning with something fierce. I have the right to make a call. Now. The judge scoffed, waving her hand for the bailiff to take him away. But Elijah didn't move. His voice came out steady, controlled. I need to call my father. And who exactly is your father? The judge asked, unimpressed. Elijah's lips curled up ever so slightly, his voice like steel. The U.S. Attorney General. The judge's face paled. A thick silence settled over the room. People turned in their seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. The bailiff hesitated. The clerk's fingers trembled over the keyboard. The judge's lips parted slightly. Elijah's heart was racing, but his voice remained calm. So, can I make my call now? And just like that, everything shifted. 2 weeks earlier, Elijah had no idea his life was about to be turned upside down. It had been a good day. One of those perfect, sunny afternoons when nothing felt wrong in the world. The sun was warm on his skin, the breeze just right. The sound of sneakers squeaking against pavement filled the air as he and his best friend, Jason, played one-on-one at the neighborhood court. Boy, you ain't got no game. Jason laughed, dribbling past him. Elijah grinned. Ain't gotta have game when you got defense. Jason went for a layup, but Elijah swatted the ball away. Ah, come on, man. Jason groaned, shaking his head. That was disrespectful. Tell your mama about it, Elijah teased. Jason shoved him playfully, and they both laughed. They had been friends since the 3rd grade. Jason was loud, reckless, and always talking too much. Elijah was calm, strategic, and never let his emotions get the best of him. After the game, they sat on the bleachers, gulping down bottles of water. You ready for the scout next week? Jason asked. Elijah nodded. Yeah. It's Duke, man. You know how much this means to me. Jason whistled. D1 scholarship. That's major. You know your pop's gotta be proud. Elijah exhaled, stretching his arms behind his head. His dad, James Jackson, wasn't just proud. He was always pushing him. No distractions, son. Stay focused. That was his favorite line. Elijah had no plans to mess this up. But life had other plans. The next day started normal. Elijah woke up, jogged his usual 2 miles, and got ready for school. His mom had made pancakes, his favorite. She kissed his forehead and reminded him to be careful. His dad had already left for D.C., where he worked. The halls of Westbrook High were buzzing with energy when he arrived. Everyone was talking about the upcoming championship game. Elijah, you better drop 30 on Friday, one of his teammates called. He just chuckled. Man, you know I got you. Then, things changed. It happened so fast. One moment, Elijah was at his locker, laughing with Jason. The next, 2 police officers were walking toward him. Elijah Jackson? He blinked. Yeah? Turn around. Hands behind your back. The words punched the air out of his lungs. Jason stepped forward. Whoa, whoa, whoa. What's going on? The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Elijah Jackson, you're under arrest for robbery and aggravated assault. Elijah's mind blanked. What? No, that's a mistake. The officers weren't listening. The cold metal snapped around his wrists. Students stopped. Phones came out. Whisper started. Jason grabbed one of the officer's arms. Hold on, you got the wrong guy? Elijah ain't done nothing. The officer shoved him back. Step away, son. Elijah's chest tightened. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. I didn't do anything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it didn't matter. He was being dragged away, and no one was stopping it. The last thing he saw was Jason's face, frozen in horror. And then, the doors of the school slammed shut behind him. The jail cell smelled of sweat and regret. Elijah sat on the cold bench, staring at the ceiling. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Hours passed. A lawyer came. A public defender. Some man in a wrinkled suit who barely looked at him. The evidence against you is strong, the man said. A witness placed you at the scene. What? What witness? The lawyer sighed. There's security footage. Someone saw you leaving the store where the robbery happened. Elijah's stomach flipped. This was a nightmare. That's impossible, he said. I wasn't even there. But no one was listening. By the time he was taken to court for his bail hearing, he had already heard what they were saying. Just another thug. Probably guilty. Look at him. Fits the description. He was drowning in it. And when the judge denied him bail, he felt the weight of it all crushing him. Now here he was. In court. A prisoner. A criminal. Framed. His whole world was burning. Until he made that call. And the judge realized. She had just sentenced the son of the most powerful prosecutor in the country. The judge's eyes widened, her mouth slightly open. The courtroom was frozen in silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The bailiff hesitated, looking at the judge as if waiting for her next command. The court clerk stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The spectators shifted in their seats, whispers beginning to rise like smoke. The judge recovered quickly, masking her shock with a cold, composed expression. That information is irrelevant to this court, she said, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. Take him away. Elijah's heart pounded, but he stood tall. I still have the right to a phone call. For a moment, the judge said nothing. Then she glanced at the bailiff and gave a small nod. The officer hesitated before gripping Elijah's arm and pulling him toward the exit. His mother sobbed in the back, reaching out as if she could somehow stop what was happening. His father remained still, but his jaw was tight, his knuckles white. Elijah turned his head, locking eyes with his dad. That was all it took. His father gave him the smallest nod. A silent promise. Something was about to change. 24 hours earlier, Elijah had been sitting at home, eating a plate of his mother's spaghetti. Nothing felt wrong. His biggest concern was whether he'd have time to study for his chemistry test after basketball practice. He had no idea that, at that very moment, someone was setting him up for a crime he didn't commit. Elijah, slow down, his mom said, watching him inhale his food. You act like I don't feed you. He grinned, shoving another bite into his mouth. It's too good, Ma. She shook her head, laughing. You always know how to sweet-talk me. His phone buzzed. A text from Jason. Jason, bro, let's hit the gym tomorrow morning. 5 a.m. No excuses. Elijah groaned. Man, Jason's trying to kill me. His mom raised a brow. What now? Early morning workout. He thinks we're going pro tomorrow. She chuckled. That boy's got energy for days. But I like that he keeps you focused. Elijah just nodded, finishing his food. He didn't know this would be the last normal meal he'd have in a long time. At 5 a.m., Elijah dragged himself out of bed and met Jason at the gym. The air was crisp, the sky still dark. Jason was already waiting, dribbling a basketball. Took you long enough. Man, it's 5 in the morning. Jason just grinned. No excuses, remember? They worked out for an hour, pushing each other, laughing, sweating. By the time they were done, Elijah felt good. Strong. Ready for anything. Or so he thought. They left the gym and walked to the corner store to grab some water. As they stepped inside, an older man behind the counter nodded at them. Morning, boys. Morning, Elijah said, grabbing a bottle from the fridge. Jason did the same, tossing $1 on the counter. You see the game last night? The store owner laughed. Man, don't even get me started. My team was robbed. Jason groaned. I told you, your team's trash. The man pointed a playful finger at him. Get out of my store before I ban you. They all laughed, and Elijah felt nothing but warmth. That moment would haunt him later. Because just 10 minutes after they left, someone else walked into that store. Someone wearing a hoodie. Someone with a gun. And someone who looked just enough like Elijah for it to change his entire life. Back in the courtroom holding cell, Elijah sat on a bench, staring at the wall. His mind was racing. The judge had looked scared when he said his father's name. That meant something. But what? Would she try to cover it up? Would she double down and make things worse? The door opened, and a guard stepped in. Phone call. Elijah stood, forcing himself to stay calm. He followed the guard to a small booth with a landline phone. The receiver was heavy in his hand. He dialed the number he knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Then, a deep voice answered. James Jackson. Elijah exhaled. Dad, it's me. Silence. Then, his father's voice came sharp and controlled. Where are you? Elijah swallowed hard. Jail. Another silence. Longer this time. Then, his father spoke, his voice like steel. Who's the judge? Elijah told him. He heard a breath on the other end of the line. Then, just 3 words. I'm on my way. Click. Elijah stared at the phone, heart pounding. Something was coming. Something big. And the judge? She had no idea what she had just done. Elijah hung up the phone and sat back in the cold metal chair, his heart hammering. His father's voice had been calm, too calm. That was the dangerous kind of calm. James Jackson wasn't just any lawyer. He was the U.S. Attorney General, the highest-ranking prosecutor in the country. He had sent drug lords to prison for life. He had taken down corrupt politicians. And now, his own son had been framed for a crime he didn't commit. Elijah didn't know what was about to happen. But he knew one thing. It wasn't going to be quiet. The guard grabbed his arm. Phone call's over. Elijah didn't resist. He let them lead him back into the holding cell. He sat down on the hard bench, his fists clenched. Now, all he could do was wait. The judge, Linda Brewster, sat in her chambers, staring at the wall. Her hands were shaking. Her career had been built on authority, control. But now, for the first time in years, she felt something else. Fear. James Jackson. She knew that name well. She had followed his cases, watched his speeches, seen him dismantle men twice as powerful as her. And now, she had sentenced his son to 15 years in prison. A son who, if she was being honest, she had barely looked at. Just another black kid in an orange jumpsuit. Just another name on a docket. Just another case to close. But she had made a mistake. A big one. Her intercom buzzed. Judge Brewster. Her assistant's voice came through. She swallowed hard. Yes. You have a call from the Attorney General's office. Judge Brewster's stomach turned to stone. She closed her eyes, inhaled sharply, then picked up the phone. Judge Brewster speaking. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, a voice. Linda. She gripped the receiver tighter. James. His voice was steady, but there was weight in it. A quiet kind of anger. I assume you know why I'm calling, James said. Judge Brewster pressed her lips together. She knew exactly why. Still, she tried to keep her voice firm. Mr. Jackson, I can't discuss an active case. You framed my son. His voice was so sharp, she nearly flinched. You framed him, James repeated, slower this time. And I want to know why. The judge felt her throat tighten. The evidence. The evidence is garbage, and you know it. Silence. Judge Brewster swallowed. She had been on the bench long enough to recognize when she was trapped. And right now, she was. Finally, she let out a slow breath. What do you want? James didn't answer right away. Then, he said, don't move. I'm on my way. The line went dead. Judge Brewster put the phone down with shaking hands. This wasn't just a bad case. This was about to be war. Back in his cell, Elijah sat on the bench, his back against the wall. He could hear the distant sounds of other prisoners talking, shouting. The smell of sweat and bleach filled the air. Then, the door buzzed. A guard stepped in. Jackson, on your feet. Elijah stood. You made a call, huh? The guard said, eyeing him. Guess you got friends in high places. Elijah didn't respond. They walked through the halls, past other cells. Some of the inmates called out. Yo, what's up with you, kid? They railroading you. You ain't gonna last a day in Gen Pop. Elijah kept his eyes forward. He wasn't going to be here long. At least, he hoped. The guard led him into a small holding room. It was empty, except for a metal table and 2 chairs. Wait here, the guard said, then left. Elijah sat down, resting his hands on the table. Minutes passed. Then, the door opened, and his father walked in. James Jackson wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself like a giant. His suit was crisp, his tie perfect. His eyes were cold, calculating. The same look he wore when cross-examining criminals on the stand. He didn't smile. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at Elijah, as if assessing the damage. Then he sat down. Elijah swallowed hard. Dad, you listen to me. James cut in, his voice low but firm. You say nothing to anyone. No statements. No answers. Nothing. Elijah nodded. James leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. We are getting you out of here. But I need you to trust me. I do. His father's eyes darkened. This judge, he said. She thinks she can get away with this. Elijah exhaled. Why is she doing this? I don't even know her. His father's expression turned to stone. That's what I'm going to find out. Just then, the door opened again. A different officer stepped inside. Sir, the judge would like to speak with you. James stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. Good. I was just about to request a meeting. Elijah watched his father walk out of the room, his heart pounding. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Judge Brewster sat in her chambers, her fingers tapping against the desk. She had faced dangerous criminals, ruthless defense attorneys, and high-pressure trials. But none of them terrified her the way James Jackson did. The door opened. James Jackson stepped inside, his expression unreadable. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud. Judge Brewster inhaled sharply. Please, have a seat. James didn't move. He didn't even blink. You framed my son, he said. His voice was calm, too calm. Judge Brewster cleared her throat. I don't know what you mean. James leaned forward, placing both hands on her desk. His eyes bore into her. You and I both know Elijah didn't do this, he said. So, I'm going to ask you one more time why. The judge swallowed. Mr. Jackson, I assure you. James cut her off. Do not lie to me. Silence. The judge exhaled, shifting in her seat. She could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a father fighting for his son. This was the Attorney General dissecting her like a hostile witness. Judge Brewster folded her hands on the desk. Look, this case came across my desk with overwhelming evidence. James tilted his head. Overwhelming? A grainy security tape and one unreliable witness? That's what you call overwhelming. The judge flinched. The system isn't perfect. James' voice was ice. No, it's not. Especially for black kids like my son. Her throat tightened. He was right. She knew it. James straightened up. So I'll ask again. Who told you to push this case? Judge Brewster hesitated. Then, she whispered, you don't understand. James narrowed his eyes. Then make me understand. The judge exhaled shakily. Then, she leaned in, lowering her voice. There are people involved in this case that are bigger than me. Bigger than this court. James frowned. Who? She shook her head. If I tell you, I put myself in danger. James stared at her for a long moment. Then, he pulled out his phone. I'm making some calls, he said. And if I find out you had anything to do with this, if you signed off on framing my son for your own gain. He stepped closer. You'll be wearing an orange jumpsuit next. The judge paled. James turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. And Judge Brewster sat in her chair, shaking. She knew the truth. And soon, so would he. Back in the holding room, Elijah paced back and forth, his hands still cuffed in front of him. The door opened. His mother rushed in. Oh, baby. She pulled him into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. Elijah squeezed his eyes shut. Mom, I didn't do it. She pulled back, cupping his face. I know you didn't, sweetheart. We're going to fix this. His father walked in behind her, his face unreadable. Elijah looked between them. What's going on? James exhaled. I spoke to the judge. Elijah's stomach clenched. And James hesitated. Then, he said, this is bigger than we thought. Elijah's breath hitched. What do you mean? James glanced at his wife, then back at Elijah. Son, you weren't just framed by a corrupt judge. He lowered his voice. There's someone else pulling the strings. Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears. His mother gasped. James' face was hard as stone. And then, the door burst open. A group of officers stormed in. One of them held up a piece of paper. James Jackson, you're under arrest. Elijah's heart stopped. What? His mother shrieked. The officer grabbed James' arm, snapping a pair of cuffs onto his wrists. You have the right to remain silent, the officer said. Elijah couldn't breathe. Dad. James looked at him, his face calm. But his eyes burned with fury. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a war. Elijah watched in horror as the officers locked the cold steel handcuffs around his father's wrists. His mother gasped, stumbling backward, her hands flying to her mouth. "You can't do this," she cried. "He hasn't done anything." James Jackson remained still, his expression unreadable. He didn't resist, didn't argue. He just stared at the officer in front of him. "What are the charges?" James asked, his voice as sharp as a blade. The officer held up the warrant. Obstruction of justice. Witness tampering. Abuse of power. Elijah's stomach twisted. He knew what this was. A distraction. Whoever was behind this, whoever had framed him, was now coming after his father. And that meant one thing. They were getting closer to the truth. "No," Elijah growled, stepping forward. "You can't." A guard grabbed his arm, shoving him back. "Stay put, kid." Elijah clenched his fists. "You're arresting the U.S. Attorney General based on what?" The officer didn't answer. His father smirked. "I'd love to see what evidence you have." The officer didn't flinch. "You can discuss that with your lawyer." James let out a small chuckle. "I am the lawyer." The officers ignored him, pushing him toward the door. "Dad," Elijah shouted. James turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. And in that moment, Elijah knew. His father wasn't scared. He was calculating, planning, because the people who had just arrested him, they had made a very, very big mistake. Judge Brewster sat at her desk, staring at the breaking news on her phone. U.S. Attorney General James Jackson arrested on federal charges. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the article. She knew what this was. It was a power play. Whoever was orchestrating this, whoever had framed Elijah, had just silenced the one man who could stop them. Judge Brewster had spent her career making sure she was on the right side of power. But now she wasn't so sure. She knew James Jackson was innocent. She knew Elijah was innocent. And yet, she had allowed it to happen. But the look in James Jackson's eyes earlier. She knew he wasn't done. And when he fought back, he wouldn't just expose the truth. He would burn everything down. Elijah sat in his cell, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Jason's voice echoed in his head. "You ready for the scout next week?" It felt like another lifetime. One day, he had been a high school senior with a basketball scholarship on the horizon. Now, he was an inmate. His father was in custody, and his whole life had been shattered. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The door buzzed. A guard stepped in. "Jackson, you got a visitor." Elijah frowned. He stood up and followed the guard out of the cell. When he stepped into the visitor's room, his stomach flipped. Sitting at the table was someone he never expected to see. Judge Brewster. Elijah froze. The judge lifted her eyes to his. And then, she said something that made his heart stop. "I think I made a mistake." Elijah's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. Elijah sat down slowly, his eyes locked on Judge Brewster. His hands were still cuffed, the cold metal biting into his wrists, but he barely noticed. "I think I made a mistake." Her words echoed in his head. Elijah narrowed his eyes. "You think?" The judge exhaled, folding her hands on the table. She hesitated, glancing at the guard standing near the door. Then, she lowered her voice. "I shouldn't be here." Elijah leaned forward. "Then why are you?" Judge Brewster swallowed. "Because I know what's happening to you isn't right." Elijah let out a bitter laugh. "Wow, now you figure that out." The judge flinched. "You looked me in the eye and sent me to prison," Elijah hissed. "You didn't even hesitate. And now you think you made a mistake?" Judge Brewster's face tightened. "I know you're angry." Elijah's voice sharpened. "I'm not angry. I'm furious." The room went silent. The judge pressed her lips together. "I didn't have all the facts before." Elijah scoffed. "You had enough facts. You just didn't care." Judge Brewster took a deep breath. "You're right." Elijah blinked. He hadn't expected that. The judge exhaled. "I let myself be pushed into a decision before I looked at the full picture. And now your father has been arrested, and I know that wasn't supposed to happen." Elijah's stomach clenched. "So you knew I was being set up?" he asked slowly. Judge Brewster hesitated, then nodded. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. His hands balled into fists. "Then why did you do it?" The judge's voice dropped. "Because I was scared." Elijah's anger faltered for half a second. Judge Brewster sighed. "This case was handed to me with pressure to move fast. The evidence was weak, but the people behind it? They aren't people you say no to." Elijah's chest tightened. "Who are they?" The judge shook her head. "I can't say. Not yet." Elijah gritted his teeth. "That's not good enough." Judge Brewster looked away. "I know." Silence stretched between them. "Then," she said, "but I want to make it right." Elijah narrowed his eyes. And how exactly do you plan to do that? The judge hesitated. By giving you a name. Elijah's breath hitched. Judge Brewster leaned forward. The person who framed you, the person pulling the strings, is someone inside the justice system. Elijah's pulse pounded. Who? The judge's lips parted. And then, the door burst open. 2 officers stormed in. Judge Brewster, one of them barked. You need to come with us. Her face went pale. Elijah's stomach dropped. Why? The judge demanded. One of the officers pulled out a warrant. You're being placed under investigation for judicial misconduct. Elijah's eyes widened. No, he said. No. This is a setup. The officers grabbed the judge's arms. Judge Brewster struggled. You don't understand. I was. One of the officers leaned down and whispered something into her ear. Whatever it was, her face drained of color. And then, she stopped fighting. Elijah shot to his feet. What did you just say to her? The officer ignored him, pulling the judge toward the door. Before they reached it, Judge Brewster turned her head. Her eyes locked onto Elijah's. And then, in a voice just loud enough for him to hear, she whispered, Don't stop fighting. The door slammed shut behind her. Elijah stood frozen. Everything inside him burned. They weren't just framing him anymore. They were silencing anyone who got in their way. And now, there was only one thing left to do. Fight back. Elijah sat frozen, his mind spinning. Judge Brewster was gone. Hauled away just like his father. And now, he was alone. His breath came fast. His heart slammed against his ribs. The walls of the jail cell felt tighter, like they were closing in. The air was thick, suffocating. This wasn't just about a rigged case anymore. This was bigger. Whoever was behind this wasn't just after him. They were eliminating everyone who got too close. His father, the judge. Who was next? Elijah clenched his fists. He couldn't sit back and let this happen. But what could he do? He was a kid, a high school senior who was supposed to be thinking about college, not fighting a system built to bury him. But maybe he wasn't just a kid. He was James Jackson's son, and that meant he wasn't going down without a fight. Across town, in a high-security federal detention center, James Jackson sat in a dimly lit cell. His suit jacket was gone, his tie loosened. But his posture? Still perfect. His mind was sharp, calculating. They thought they had him cornered. They were wrong. James had spent his entire career fighting corruption, tearing apart conspiracies, exposing powerful men who thought they were untouchable. Now, those same people were coming for him. A foolish mistake. Because if there was one thing they should have learned by now, it was this. James Jackson never lost. A guard appeared outside his cell. You've got a visitor. James stood, his face unreadable. They led him to a small, private interrogation room. The second he stepped inside, he saw who was waiting for him. A man in a dark suit. Clean-shaven. Cold eyes. James recognized him instantly. FBI Special Agent Mark Devlin. One of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. James sat down across from him. He didn't speak. Devlin leaned back in his chair. You look calm for a man in your position. James smirked. That's because I know something you don't. Devlin arched a brow. And what's that? James' smile faded. That you just made the worst mistake of your career. Devlin chuckled. You think you can scare me, Jackson? James didn't blink. I don't need to scare you. The truth will do that for me. Devlin's smirk twitched. James leaned forward. I know what you're doing. I know this entire case is a setup. I know my son was framed. And I know you're trying to cover your tracks. Devlin's expression didn't change. You're delusional. James exhaled slowly, then tilted his head. You went after me because you thought that without me, my son would have no way to fight back. He smiled. That's where you miscalculated. Devlin frowned slightly. James' eyes darkened. Because Elijah isn't just any kid. He's my kid. Back at the jail, Elijah sat in his cell, replaying the judge's last words in his head. Don't stop fighting. But how? He needed help. He needed someone on the outside. Then it hit him. Jason. Jason was the only person who knew him, knew his every move. If anyone could help prove where he was that day, it was him. Elijah stood and walked to the bars. Hey, he called out. I need to make another call. A guard glanced at him, unimpressed. You already got your one call. Elijah's jaw clenched. That was before my dad got arrested. I have the right to another call. The guard sighed, but didn't move. Elijah's mind raced. He needed a way to make them listen. Then, he smirked. You sure you want to deny the Attorney General's son his legal rights? The guard's eyes flickered. Then, Without another word, he unlocked the cell and led Elijah to the phone. Elijah picked up the receiver and dialed the only number that mattered right now. It rang once, twice. Then, Jason picked up. Yo, Elijah? Bro, where are you? What's going on? I saw your dad on the news. Jason, Elijah cut in. Listen to me. I don't have much time. I need your help. Jason's voice turned serious. What do you need? Elijah gripped the phone tighter. I need you to prove where I was the day of the robbery. Jason hesitated. Elijah, I don't even know what they're saying you did. I was framed, Elijah said quickly. And now they've taken my dad. This isn't just about me anymore. It's bigger. I need you to find anything that proves I wasn't at that store. Jason exhaled sharply. Okay, let me think. Elijah swallowed. We were at the gym that morning, right? There's got to be security footage. A timestamp. Something. Jason went quiet for a second. Then, wait. Elijah's heartbeat quickened. What? I took a video that morning. Jason said suddenly. We were goofing off after practice. I filmed you dunking on me. If there's a timestamp on that video, then it proves I wasn't anywhere near that robbery, Elijah finished. Jason cursed under his breath. I'll find it. I'll send it to your mom, your dad's legal team, everyone. Elijah exhaled, relief crashing into him. Jason, you just saved my life. Jason let out a dry laugh. Yeah, well, let's not celebrate yet. I still gotta find it. But I swear I got you. Elijah closed his eyes. Hope. For the first time in days, he had hope. Then, a loud bang echoed from somewhere in the jail. Elijah's eyes snapped open. Shouting. Heavy footsteps. The guard by the door stiffened, reaching for his radio. Elijah's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Bro. Jason's voice came through the phone. What's happening? Elijah's grip tightened around the receiver. I don't know. Then, the power cut out, and the entire jail plunged into darkness. The lights went out. The entire jail plunged into darkness. Shouting erupted down the hall. Heavy footsteps. Clanking metal. Guards barking orders. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. What the? The guard next to him fumbled for his radio. Control, what's going on? Control. No response. Bro. Jason's voice crackled through the receiver. Elijah? You still there? Elijah gripped the phone tighter. Something's happening. A loud boom shook the building. Elijah's heart slammed against his ribs. That wasn't just a random sound. That was an explosion. Yo, Jason, get off the phone. Elijah hissed. Something's. The line went dead. Silence. The guard reached for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a deep click echoed through the dark. Elijah knew that sound. A gun being cocked. Don't move. A new voice. Low. Dangerous. Elijah's entire body tensed. The guard stiffened. What the hell? Shut up, the voice growled. A second later, the dim emergency lights flickered on. Red strobes flashed across the room. And that's when Elijah saw them. 3 men, dressed in black. Tactical gear. Masks covering their faces. Armed. Elijah's blood ran cold. These weren't cops. These weren't guards. This was a break-in. One of the men stepped forward, gun raised. Take the kid, he ordered. Elijah's chest tightened. What? The guard lunged for his radio, bang. A single gunshot. The guard collapsed, clutching his leg. Move. One of the masked men grabbed Elijah's arm. Elijah fought. He twisted, tried to yank away, but they were strong. They forced him toward the exit. No. Elijah thrashed, his heart hammering. Who were these people? Where were they taking him? His mind raced. This wasn't a rescue. This was something else. And that meant one thing. Whoever had framed him wasn't done. They needed him gone. Permanently. Meanwhile, across the city, James Jackson sat in his cell, eyes closed, mind sharp. Then, the sound hit him. A distant boom. James' eyes snapped open. That wasn't thunder. That was an explosion. Something was happening. James stood, listening carefully. Shouting. A guard running past his cell. Sirens blaring. He stepped toward the bars. What's going on? No answer. A sick feeling twisted in his gut. Then, a guard sprinted past. James caught his arm through the bars. Where's my son? James demanded. The guard hesitated. James yanked him closer. Where is Elijah? The guard swallowed hard. Sir, someone just broke into the jail. James' blood ran ice cold. They're taking him. James went still. Then, his fists clenched. And for the first time in his life, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pure, unfiltered fear. Back at the jail, Elijah was dragged down a dark hallway. His wrists were still cuffed, making it impossible to fight back. "Where are you taking me?" he shouted. No answer. The men moved fast, tactical. Elijah's chest heaved. He couldn't let this happen. He refused to let this happen. And then, he saw his chance. As they pushed him around a corner, one of the men loosened his grip for just a second. Elijah acted. He threw his weight forward, then swung his leg back as hard as he could. His heel slammed into the guy's knee. The man yelled, stumbling. Elijah didn't wait. He ran. He sprinted down the hall, heart racing, cuffs digging into his skin. "Stop him," someone shouted. "Not today." Elijah rounded a corner, then skidded to a stop. A fourth masked man stood in front of him, gun raised. "Game over, kid." Elijah's stomach dropped. The man stepped closer, finger on the trigger. And then, a deafening gunshot rang out. The man jerked. Then he collapsed. Elijah gasped. Standing behind him, gun smoking, was a familiar face. Jason. Elijah's eyes widened. Jason lowered the gun, breathing hard. "Bro," he panted. "We gotta go." Elijah's chest tightened. Jason had come for him. And now, they were getting out. Elijah stood frozen, his breath coming in short gasps. The gunshot still rang in his ears. Jason lowered the smoking gun, his hands shaking. His chest heaved as he locked eyes with Elijah. "Bro," he said again, "we gotta move." Elijah snapped out of it. He nodded fast, his mind racing. Behind them, shouts erupted. The remaining masked men were regrouping. Footsteps pounded against the concrete floor. "There," one of them yelled. "Find the kid." Elijah and Jason took off. They sprinted down the hall, weaving through the chaos. Red emergency lights flickered above them, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "How did you get in here?" Elijah panted as they ran. Jason clenched his jaw. "It wasn't easy. Had to call in some favors. Don't ask." Elijah's heart pounded. "You shot that guy?" Jason didn't even blink. "And I'll do it again if I have to. Keep moving." Elijah couldn't even process that. Jason was his best friend, loud, reckless, but not violent. Not like this. And yet, here he was, risking everything. For him. The hallway opened up into a loading dock. Large metal doors stood ahead, slightly ajar. A black SUV sat just outside, engine running. Jason pointed. "That's us." Elijah ran faster, his lungs burning. But just as they reached the doors, a gunshot rang out. Sparks flew as a bullet slammed into the metal beside them. "Get down," Jason yelled, yanking Elijah behind a stack of crates. More shots followed. The masked men had caught up. Elijah's pulse skyrocketed. "We're trapped." Jason peeked out, then ducked back. "No, we're not." He grabbed a wrench from a nearby shelf. With a quick twist, he loosened a heavy chain securing a stack of steel pipes. "On my signal," Jason whispered. Elijah's breath hitched. "Now." Jason shoved the stack hard. With a loud clatter, the pipes came crashing down, spilling across the floor like an avalanche. The masked men barely had time to react. They stumbled back, cursing, trying to dodge the rolling metal. "Go!" Jason shouted. Elijah didn't hesitate. They sprinted for the SUV. The driver, an older man in a baseball cap, threw open the doors. "Move, move, move." Elijah jumped in. Jason followed, slamming the door behind him. The second the doors shut, the driver floored it. Tires screeched. The SUV peeled out of the loading dock, bursting onto the road. Elijah's head slammed against the seat. His heart raced. They had made it. They had escaped. But the fight? It was far from over. Back at the detention center, James Jackson sat in his cell, gripping the bars. The explosion. The chaos. And now, his son was missing. His mind worked fast. Who had taken Elijah? Where was he now? A guard rushed past. James reached through the bars and grabbed his shirt. "Where is my son?" he demanded. The guard looked panicked. I don't know, sir." The prison was breached. "Someone took him." James' stomach twisted. He released the guard, his mind spinning. He had been fighting cases his whole life. He had taken on criminals, corrupt officials, powerful men who thought they were untouchable. But this was personal. And whoever was behind it, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. James Jackson wasn't going to wait for the system to fix this. He was going to burn it down himself. Elijah gripped the door handle as the SUV sped down the highway. His wrists still ached from the cuffs, but he barely felt it. Jason exhaled sharply. "Bro, you okay?" Elijah shook his head. No, I'm not okay." He turned to Jason, his eyes wild. What is happening? Jason rubbed his forehead. I don't know, man. But I wasn't about to sit back and let them take you. Elijah let out a shaky breath. Who were those guys? The driver spoke for the first time. They weren't cops, the man said, gripping the wheel tight. That was a hit squad. Elijah's blood ran cold. Hey, what? The driver glanced at him in the mirror. Whoever framed you doesn't want you locked up anymore. His voice was grim. They want you dead. Elijah's breath hitched. Jason cursed under his breath. So what do we do? The driver's jaw tightened. First, we disappear. He took a sharp turn, heading toward the outskirts of the city. Then, Elijah whispered. The driver's eyes darkened. Then, we fight back. Elijah swallowed hard. Because he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. Elijah sat in the back of the SUV, his pulse hammering in his ears. The world outside blurred past, dark trees lining the highway. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been kidnapped, but not by criminals looking for ransom. These people had tried to kill him. And now, he was in a getaway car with his best friend and a driver he didn't even know. Elijah turned to Jason. Who is this guy? Jason hesitated. A friend. Elijah narrowed his eyes. A friend? Jason, I just got dragged out of jail by a SWAT team that wasn't even SWAT. And now, we're in a car with some random dude. The driver chuckled darkly. I'm not random, kid. Elijah tensed. Then who are you? The man glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were sharp, calculating. Name's Randall. Used to work in places I'd rather not talk about. What places? Elijah pressed. Randall smirked. Let's just say, places that don't officially exist. Elijah frowned. He didn't trust this guy. Jason leaned forward. Randall's the one who helped me get inside to find you. He knows people. He knows how to move without being seen. Elijah exhaled sharply. And what's in it for you? Randall's smirk faded. Your father put some bad people away. The kind that don't forget. I owed him. Elijah's stomach twisted. His dad had taken down a lot of criminals in his career. But this wasn't just revenge. This was bigger. Where are we going? Elijah asked. Randall's hands gripped the wheel. Somewhere safe. Elijah swallowed hard. He didn't like how that sounded. Back at the detention center, James Jackson stood near the bars of his cell, his fists clenched. He had just gotten word. Elijah was gone, and no one knew where he was. His chest tightened. His son had already been framed for a crime he didn't commit. Now, someone had escalated. This was no longer about locking Elijah away. This was about making sure he never came back. A guard appeared outside his cell. Mr. Jackson, the man said carefully, his face tense. You have another visitor. James frowned. He had already spoken to his lawyer. Who else could it be? The door buzzed, unlocking. A man in a crisp gray suit stepped inside, his expression unreadable. James tensed. He knew this man. Director Thomas Greer, head of the FBI. Greer stepped closer, adjusting his tie. James. James didn't blink. What do you want? Greer exhaled slowly. I want to help you. James laughed coldly. You? Help me. Greer sat down across from him. You don't trust me. I get that. Trust. James' voice was sharp. My son was framed under your watch. My case was shut down before it even started. And now, Elijah has been taken. So forgive me if I don't feel particularly trusting. Greer sighed. I didn't sign off on this, James. Someone higher up did. James leaned forward. Who? Greer's eyes darkened. That's what I'm trying to find out. James clenched his jaw. Then you're running out of time. Because if anything happens to my son, Greer held up a hand. We'll find him. But you need to tell me something first. James frowned. What? Greer exhaled. Who else knew Elijah was in danger? James narrowed his eyes. Why does that matter? Greer hesitated. Then, he said something that made James' stomach drop. Because someone inside the system is feeding information to the people who took him. James froze. A traitor. Someone inside the government was working with the people behind this. His blood ran cold. Because now, Elijah wasn't just running from his kidnappers. He was running from the entire system. Back in the SUV, Jason checked his phone. Man, we need to figure out where we're going next. Randall turned onto a back road, the city lights fading behind them. Elijah ran a hand over his face. We need to find my dad's lawyer. We need to go public. If people find out what's happening. Randall shook his head. No can do, kid. Elijah frowned. Why not? Randall's jaw tightened. Because the second you go public, you won't make it through the night. Elijah's stomach twisted. Jason swallowed hard. So what do we do? Randall glanced at them in the mirror. We go off the grid. And we find the people behind this ourselves. Elijah's pulse pounded. How? Randall's smirk returned. By making them think they already won. Elijah's breath hitched. What do you mean? Randall's smirk widened. We fake your death. Elijah's heart stopped. Jason's mouth fell open. Wait, what? Randall nodded. They want you dead, right? So let's give them what they want. Elijah stared at him. That's insane. Randall shrugged. Yeah, but it's also the only way to beat them at their own game. Elijah exhaled sharply. This was crazy. But maybe crazy was exactly what they needed. Jason shook his head. Bro, you seriously considering this? Elijah clenched his fists. He had no choice. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to win, then the world needed to believe Elijah Jackson was already dead. He met Randall's gaze. Tell me the plan. Elijah sat in the back of the SUV, his mind racing. Fake his death? The idea felt impossible. Stupid. Insane. And yet, it might be the only way. Jason ran a hand down his face. Man, this is crazy. This is some movie stuff. Randall didn't blink. That's the point. Elijah swallowed hard. How? Randall smirked. Leave that to me. Elijah exhaled. He didn't trust this guy. But right now, he had no better options. Jason shook his head. I don't like this, bro. Elijah turned to him. You got a better idea? Jason clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Randall pulled the SUV onto a dirt road, heading deep into the woods. Where are we going? Elijah asked. Randall's grip tightened on the wheel. Somewhere quiet. Elijah's pulse pounded. This was happening. For real. Back at the detention center, James Jackson paced the small room where he had been moved for questioning. The moment Greer had told him there was a traitor inside the system, something had clicked. Someone had known exactly when to move. Someone had known exactly how to shut this case down before it even started. Someone had targeted his son, and James was about to find out who. The door opened. An officer walked in, placing a file on the table. Sir, we pulled a list of everyone who had access to your son's case before his arrest. James grabbed it fast, flipping through the pages. Lawyers, officers, court clerks. Then, his eyes landed on a name. His stomach dropped. No, not him. His hands tightened around the paper. The traitor wasn't some random corrupt official. It was someone James had trusted. And that meant this wasn't just about Elijah. This was personal. James exhaled slowly. If this man thought he could get away with it, he was dead wrong. Back in the woods, Randall parked the SUV and killed the engine. The night was eerily quiet. No streetlights. No sounds of the city. Just the hum of crickets in the darkness. Elijah stepped out, his breath visible in the cold air. Now what? Jason asked. Randall pulled a small device from his jacket. A burner phone. We send a message. Elijah frowned. To who? Randall's eyes gleamed. To the people who want you dead. Jason tensed. Why would we do that? Randall didn't answer. He just typed something on the phone. Then, he hit send. A second later, Elijah's own phone, his real phone, the one the cops had taken, buzzed. Jason frowned. Wait, how do you have Elijah's phone? Randall smirked. I have my ways. Elijah grabbed the phone. His stomach turned when he saw the message. Unknown. The target has been eliminated. Confirmed fatal. No loose ends. Elijah's breath caught. Who sent this? Randall nodded toward the phone. The people who want you dead. Elijah's chest tightened. So now they think I'm actually. Randall nodded. Gone. Off the grid. No longer a problem. Jason rubbed his face. Man, this is crazy. Elijah stared at the phone. This wasn't over. But now, he had something he didn't before. An advantage. What now? Elijah asked. Randall's smirk widened. Now? Now we make them regret ever coming after you. Elijah exhaled. For the first time in days, he didn't feel helpless. He felt dangerous. And whoever had done this to him, they were about to find out what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Elijah sat in the stillness of the woods, the burner phone heavy in his hand. They thought he was dead. And now, for the first time, he had the upper hand. Randall stood a few feet away, watching the tree line like a hawk. Jason paced near the SUV, rubbing his hands together. The air was thick, charged with something electric. Elijah clenched his jaw. Now what? Randall turned, his eyes sharp. Now we go hunting. Elijah's pulse quickened. Hunting? For who? Randall stepped closer. Whoever set you up. Whoever gave the order. Whoever thought they could erase you like you don't matter? Jason swallowed hard. So, we're really doing this? Elijah looked at him. Yeah, we are. Jason let out a breath. Man, I did not sign up for Mission Impossible. Elijah smirked slightly. Too late. Randall nodded. First step, find the traitor. And I think your dad already has an idea who it is. Elijah's stomach tightened. We need to get to him. Randall's face darkened. Then let's move. Meanwhile, at the detention center, James Jackson stared at the name on the file. His chest burned with fury. The traitor. The one who had made all of this possible. The name was one he knew. Someone who had been close to him for years. FBI Director Thomas Greer. James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Greer had played him, had pretended to be on his side, while secretly feeding information to the people trying to kill his son. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated James Jackson. The door to his cell buzzed. A guard stepped in. Jackson, you're being transferred. James frowned. Transferred where? The guard didn't answer. James' instincts flared. This wasn't right. Then he saw it. The guard's hand hovering near his hip, near his gun. James reacted instantly. With one swift motion, he lunged, grabbing the guard's wrist and twisting. The gun clattered to the floor. Lockdown, another guard shouted. James didn't wait. He grabbed the fallen weapon, spun, and fired once. The lock on the cell door shattered. Chaos erupted. James ran. Down the hall. Past shouting officers. Past blaring alarms. He wasn't stopping. Not until he reached his son. 30 minutes later, Elijah and Jason sat in a dark warehouse on the outskirts of town. Randall had driven them there, making sure they were off the grid. No cameras. No phones. No trail. Jason exhaled. Okay, so what's the plan? Randall pulled out another burner phone. Your dad's moving. He knows who's behind this. We need to intercept him before they do. Elijah tensed. What do you mean, before they do? Randall's jaw tightened. If I know Greer, he won't let your father leave that prison alive. Elijah's heart stopped. We have to go. Randall nodded. Buckle up, kid. At a remote airfield, James Jackson burst through a side exit of the detention center, his breath ragged. He had one shot at this. A black car skidded to a stop in front of him. The door flew open. Get in. James didn't hesitate. As soon as he was inside, the driver floored it. James turned, expecting to see one of his allies. Instead, he saw Thomas Greer. James' blood ran cold. Greer smirked. Going somewhere, James? James' fists clenched. You. Greer nodded. Me. James' pulse pounded. Why? Greer sighed. You were getting too close. So was your son. And I couldn't have that. Asterisk. James' voice was low. So you set him up. You had Judge Brewster do your dirty work. Asterisk. Greer shrugged. Brewster didn't even know what she was doing. She was just following orders. That's the beauty of power, James. You don't have to get your hands dirty. James' eyes burned with rage. Where is Elijah? Greer's smirk widened. Dead. James went still. Then, a second black car skidded to a stop in front of them. The door flew open, and Elijah stepped out. Greer's smirk vanished. James exhaled, his chest tightening. Son. Elijah's eyes locked onto Greer. Surprised? Greer's face darkened. You? Jason stepped out behind Elijah, holding a gun. Yeah, we ain't dead, fool. Randall was next, gun aimed directly at Greer. Get out of the car. Asterisk. Greer hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped out. Elijah glared at him. You tried to kill me. You set me up. You took my dad. And you lost. Asterisk. Greer chuckled. You really think this is over, kid? Elijah didn't flinch. No, but I think you just ran out of time. Asterisk. The sound of sirens filled the air. FBI vehicles stormed onto the airstrip. Agents poured out. And in that moment, James Jackson smiled. You should have stayed in the shadows, Greer. Greer's face fell. No. No, you. Agents swarmed him, guns raised. Thomas Greer, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and attempted murder. Greer's face twisted in rage. You'll never prove it. James stepped forward. We already have. Asterisk. Greer's hands were ripped behind his back. The cuffs snapped shut. And just like that, it was over. Elijah exhaled. Jason whistled. Man, that was wild. James turned to his son. Are you okay? Elijah nodded. I am now. James pulled him into a tight hug. Elijah closed his eyes, exhaling. After everything, they had won. And now? It was time to go home.